Good day. Today is June 12th. We skipped one couple of weeks for circumstances not under our control, but here we are. And the topic is migration, immigration, refugees, asylum seekers. A very hot global topic right now, not just in the US, but worldwide. The London Economist had an article a few weeks ago entitled, "More Immigrants, Less Immigration." Most countries need more immigrants, including the United States. And by the same token, there's political opposition to immigration. This is not a US problem alone. This is a problem throughout Europe. Increasingly, this will be a problem in China, India, in other words, large and in some cases not so large developing countries. And let me start by boring you a little bit with some kind of historical context. Migrations, of course, just means movements of people, and people have been moving across the world since time immemorial. There are very interesting literatures about ancient migrations and so forth, but we know that even where there's no very good record, that migration took place centuries ago. How do we know this? Well, for example, we keep reading about the mistreatment of the Uyghurs in China, right? And the Uyghurs are Turkic people. They're not Han Chinese. They don't look like Han Chinese. And they speak a language that is related to Turkish. So how did you get from Turkish in Turkey to Turkish-related language in China? Obviously, people moved. And I'm just one of many, many illustrations that one can trace ethnic origins, religion, all through history of people moving around. Sometimes in large groups, sometimes in small groups. We think sometimes because of economic circumstances, other times maybe for religious or ethnic circumstances. So there's nothing new about migrations. The question, of course, in modern times is, why are people migrating? But there's another problem. That is, before there were the nation states, there were territorial states, big swaths of land, and people pretty much roamed around them. Before there were territorial states, there were empires and other things, so people could move within those terrains. In the 17th, 18th, and even more so in the 19th century, what developed was the modern nation state. And here, I think I want to spend a minute just making sure we have sort of definitional terms. Nations, or the nation, is used very broadly speaking as without having any particular meaning in the contemporary world. Although nation, technically speaking, means a group of people who believe themselves to belong together. Why do they believe themselves to belong together? Because of religion, because of ethnicity, because of language, and so on. And the reason it's so confusing today is because, for example, we refer to the United Nations. Well, the United Nations should really be the Organization of United States. But since the United States already existed, they had to use nation, even though it technically is not really what nation means. So the word nation is thrown around as roughly speaking, but nation does mean something different. State. State, on the other hand, is a legal term. And the legal term means, and has come to mean, and is totally the meaning today, of a defined territory with a population inside of it and a government which has the capacity to govern internal to the state and has the capacity to execute foreign policy. Now, how can this be? This can be in the sense that the people inside the confines of the state have something called citizenship and are considered to be the rightful presence in that particular territory. But the fact that it's considered that a state is recognized as a state has to come from other states in the world recognizing it. So you become a state not just because you're a territory and there are people living there, but because you have a kind of hard confines around the place, which is not meant to be porous, which you govern internally, but other states recognize you as being the rightful state of whatever it is, India, the United States, France, and so forth. And part, of course, what gives the state its internal force and its international recognition is that people who live inside of it are allowed to live inside of it because the government allows them to live inside. In other words, they are citizens of that state, whether they are born or naturalized. And if they're not citizens, they're at least the state legally entitles them to be there. Okay. Now, I know this sounds very academic, but in fact, it's really quite important because people lay claims to, want to move here, there, and yonder. And when they get to a border of a state, the state says you have no entitlement to come in here unless we give you permission, and that's legal. Now, there is one change that took place during and after the Second World War, which was that someone decided, well, given Hitler and given Nazism and Mussolini and fascism, what happens if people's lives are at risk? Should the international system not give them some rules, some entitlements? And so a Pole named Anatoly Lemkin coined the word genocide, which was meant to mean that if your group of people, an ethnic group, a religious group, or an individual who was charged as belonging to an undesirable group of people, were at risk for their lives, the international system, namely other states, were entitled and in fact obliged through international law to give them something called asylum. Asylum was meant to rescue people from political annihilation based on religion, ethnicity, etc. Why did this notion of genocide evolve? Because genocide took place during the Second World War and was recognized as having taken place. And why was the notion of developing international law for asylum became so relevant and important? And that was that, before that, a state could simply say, well, we don't want these people, they're not our citizens. So the international system, through international law, all the states obliged themselves to honor asylum when someone was meeting the criteria for asylum. Now, notice what I'm saying here. It was political, religious, ethnic. It was not economic. And increasingly, since certainly the second half of the 20th century, it became obvious that people weren't just fleeing for political and religious reasons and asking for asylum, but people were wanting asylum due to economic reasons. So in the contemporary world, when you have emigration, first people wanting to leave and desiring to immigrate, right? There is that barrier, the criteria that's in international law, which states have agreed to, including, by the way, the United States, that people can be given asylum under international law. But since asylum does not cover economic refugees, people fleeing from economic disarray. We are all, meaning the United States, but also other countries, in a big muddle, right? Because lots of people, for example, who come across the U.S. border, fleeing not for their lives in the political or religious or ideological sense, but coming across the border because they can no longer make a living. So part of the contemporary problem is not only that people are leaving states and wanting other states to absorb them because their lives are at risk for political religion, but they simply can't make a living anymore. And of course, that problem is very large right now, but it will be increasing. And why will it be increasing? Because of climate change. People are migrating, just moving inside their own countries from places where they used to be able to make a living. And sometimes they believe they can make a living in their countries at all, and they want to flee and go somewhere else. And so while there's international law and there's a lot of discussion about, processing people for asylum at the border and so forth, many people are turned down simply because they cannot make a claim under international law and therefore also American law for the traditional forms of asylum and are seeking refugee status for other reasons. And these other reasons, then economic reasons, for example, climate change, not being able to farm anymore. These other reasons don't allow states to say, well, we are not obliged to take people. So you have a big mess on your hands worldwide right now. So there's three kinds of things that are happening. First, many people are moving inside their states, which is why you have such huge urbanization everywhere, because they can't make a living off the land anymore. And for climate reasons, essentially, but there may be some other reasons as well. And therefore, they hope by going to the urban centers, they can find some way to make a living. So you're having huge development of huge mega cities all over the world, 20 million people, 30 million people. And that is a whole topic and a problem on its own. But you also have people who are deciding, well, we need to go somewhere for the benefit of our families and our children. And they are becoming emigres, that is, say they're leaving, and they're hoping to immigrate somewhere and to be allowed to live somewhere else. Now, we're talking not a few people here or there from one country. The UN estimates in this year, 2023, that there are almost 200 million people drifting about who are trying to leave their countries or have left their countries, trying to find a hospitable place to land that will accept them. The UN estimates there are about 30 million refugees. There are about 6 million asylum seekers, right? Refugees don't necessarily mean people may even know that they are not entitled to asylum under typical international law right now. Then there are about 62 million people who are displaced for one reason or another. And then there are 5 or 6 million people who don't have citizenship anywhere, and that's a complicated legal issue, who are drifting about. So you move from people who want to emigrate from their own country and immigrate somewhere else. Some of these people have claims of asylum, which under contemporary international law. And other people are just refugees who wish to immigrate under immigration law, not because their lives are at risk, but they want to resettle. Now, there are countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, which, of course, are the countries made up of immigrants. If your family members came some generations ago, certainly before the 20th century, whether it's from the potato famine or something else, they could just walk into the United States, right? You didn't need a visa. You didn't need, to go to the State Department or anything. You arrived on a ship and you went to wherever, and you went to work and, settled somewhere. Then increasingly states, including the United States, decided that they wanted to control the number of people who came in, not just in terms of numbers, but who came in. So you began in the 20th century, let me just talk about the US in the early part of the century, you began to have immigration laws, which had quotas, which said, so many Italians and some others from various European countries. And then let's not have any Chinese or not too many Chinese. And then let's have not too many Japanese. And so it became both the quotas confined people in terms of where they came from, their ethnicity, their language, their places of origin. And throughout the 20th century, we had waves of different immigration laws allowing X number of people in, and they would be processed, and they would apply. They might be refugees in the technical sense. They might be in a refugee camp somewhere or something. But the broad term of refugees simply means they're seeking refuge from somewhere else, and not particularly asking for asylum, just asking to be allowed to immigrate. And then, of course, you get the situation, let's say, at the US border and in Europe and elsewhere, of people saying, these people are coming. Who are they? We can't just let them in. They may not even be seeking asylum per se. They would just like to immigrate the country. And so countries, for political and domestic reasons, are tightening the screws on the number of people and the origin of people and the reason for which people come to this country or any other country. So the immigration issue has become very complex. And on one side of complexity are just simply people who want to come to a different country and make their lives there. And on the other side, there are people who are at risk of their lives and are seeking asylum under contemporary asylum law. And in between is this gray area that people are saying, no, we don't just want to come to the US because we're bored living in, I don't know, France or, Italy or somewhere, or we have relatives there, but rather people who are saying, for example, at the US southern border, we need to move. We want to move. We want to have asylum, even though we don't qualify under asylum law, because our lives are at risk. Why are our lives at risk? Not because of their religion or their ethnicity, but because they're starving. They can't make a living, or they don't feel safe, or they think they're not going to be safe. So the whole business now is becoming very complex, and many countries are tightening the screws on, just allowing people in. And in the case of the United States, we are backlogged by years allowing normal immigrants to come to the United States. For example, somebody wants to marry somebody. It now who comes from a different country. It now can take years for that person to be allowed to come. And furthermore, even when we allow some people in, we don't necessarily allow them to acquire citizenship. So you get a situation which is especially stark in the United States, where you have millions of people who came. That's a big political issue in the United States, with parents who were asylum seekers sometimes, but mostly illegal. And they came as small children, infants. They spent their whole lives and careers here, but theoretically they can be expelled, right? Which is why there's so much conflict about passing some kind of law to allow people who came as children to continue to be American, or to become American citizens. citizen. The U.S. has a unique law which other countries don't have. That is to say, your parents can be foreign born and illegal, but if you're born in the United States, you're an American. You're an American. You have entitlement to American citizenship. That is true because we were a nation of immigrants. So as soon as people were born in the U.S., they were allowed to be immigrants. There is a right wing of the Republican Party that wants to change that and says, well, they're European countries. Even if you're born there, if your parents, let's say, are Turkish, and you're born in, I don't know, Germany or France or something, you can't automatically become French or German. Although the Germans have recently adjusted that law somewhat. So it's very legally complicated, and it's very political. Okay, and it's very discriminatory. But we think nowadays that, for example, in the United States, the problem of all these people coming over the southern border, and even people coming from far away who enter through the southern border, that these are sort of people who will change the nature of the country. They will speak separate languages. They might even be people of color, brown or black or something. And there's this, big opposition, which is often racially motivated. But also it's fear of the other and having people who speak other languages in your area. Now, we make this in the press and especially on TV nowadays, feel that this is entirely new. But allow me to say that I went to school in New York City in the 1950s. First half of the 1950s. And the issue then was not, Hispanic speaking people from Guatemala. The issue was Italians and Irish. And there was huge discrimination against Irish and Italians. And what was wrong with them? Well, they came and they at first didn't speak English. But in both cases, there might be Catholic, and if you were living in a Protestant area, did you want all these Catholics around? And they were changing our culture and whatever. And then they lived in enclaves with other people who came from their countries. Notice they were the same kind of discussions we now have about Watsonville, right? Watsonville is full of these people from Oaxaca and who are Spanish speaking, and they never learn English, and they just speak Spanish, and they're changing our environment, et cetera, all of which is at best half truth, because almost all immigrant groups in the next generation, they may still be bilingual, and often it's an advantage to be bilingual, but they in fact learn English. But in the case of, for example, during certain periods in New York City, or now in California and other places, there is the idea that people only speak those languages because, of course, there's always new waves of people coming in. So in the enclaves that are from new arrivals, of course, people speak their languages from wherever they came from. What is not well understood is that the next generation tends to move out of the next enclave. So the reason I say this is because some of what the claims that are made today about immigrants are and the charges against immigration and how they're changing our country and all the rest of it is not entirely new. There was discrimination against Germans when they arrived in the Middle West, and Swedes and so on. Oh my God, these Swedish people in Minnesota, they speak Spanish, they're not part of us, all the rest of it. And certainly in New York, which has always been a place of immigrants, you get, the kind of discrimination that has always been prevalent, but now, of course, you add, race, and you add color and all those kind of discriminatory aspects. At the moment, 45% of the American population is foreign born. So, that's a lot. And for example, in New York City, 36% of the city is foreign born. That's quite a lot. And we've always managed to integrate people, um, and the argument now is, all these people not only are changing our country, but all of these people are in fact changing uh, the very nature of the country, and that is somewhat racist at this point, right? Asians and Latin Americans and so forth are not European born, and so there's that discrimination going on. Now, the reason the article from The Economist's title, More Immigrants, Less Immigration, is the truth of the matter is that for a variety of reasons, political, but very much climatological, economic, almost all countries need immigrants. That is to say, here we are railing against the immigrants coming into the United States, but in point of fact, we have a labor shortage in this country, and immigrants are needed. And immigrants, typically many of them, are people who start at the bottom, who work in fast food chains, work in hospitals, work in motels, and so forth. And all of these endeavors in the U.S. have a shortage of labor right now. So this is not just the sort of problem elsewhere, it's a problem in the U.S. So people in the U.S. rail against, we can't possibly have all these millions of people, but actually, we actually need them for labor. So there is a contradiction and a hypocrisy about, on the one hand, we have the need for labor, on the other hand, we don't. Now, let me sort of deal with a side issue. There are, of course, people in the world who are refugees who have no particular interest in resettling somewhere, who live in refugee camps. For example, the Rohingyas, who are the ethnic group which have been expelled from Myanmar and who live in refugee camps in Bangladesh, right? These are not people who necessarily want to settle anywhere. These are people who are escaping warfare, and they're large refugees in the Middle East. For example, millions of Syrian refugees who are living, 2 to 3 million who are living in Turkey, and a couple of million living in Lebanon. Some of these people wouldn't mind settling where they have gone as refugees, but many of them are not seeking to permanently live in the countries to which they went as refugees. And so we now have a contemporary issue on a massive scale of civil wars and conflicts, and people who are refugees from where they're living without necessarily wanting to be immigrants to some other country in which they permanently want to live. So that is an interesting aside, and it's a huge global problem right now, which is somewhat of a separate topic. But then you have in-between categories, and that's why I want to bring it back to the topic of today. The people in Afghanistan who worked for the Americans and the people in Iraq who worked for the Americans were promised that not only could they be refugees somewhere else because the current governments would go after them and might make life miserable for them, and they might in fact lose their lives, but they could in fact get equivalent of asylum status for the services that they did for the United States. And it's a big American scandal that those people are not processed quickly, and there's still thousands of people in both those countries who were promised not just refuge in the United States, but asylum in the United States, which means they could then become citizens if they want to, or dual citizenship. So you have layers. You have legal immigrants who are welcome for one reason or another. You have refugees who are escaping wherever for their lives, who temporarily might seek refuge without necessarily seeking a permanent asylum. You have asylum seekers and international law prevailing the obligations of states to take asylum seekers. And you have now large groups of people who think they qualify under asylum, but the asylum laws would need to be changed for them to get the same, at least legal status that the traditional asylum seekers have received. So we have an international legal mess with respect to this. We have a national US mess, as do some European countries, about not allowing, for example, the boat people in and to ask for asylum. And you have large numbers of refugees floating about in refugee camps, whether it's a huge refugee camp from Somalia and Kenya, whether it's refugee camps in Ethiopia, Sudan, assorted places. And then there are UN provisions to, help refugees. Many are in camps, but many also are waiting to go somewhere. So while the refugees, which are not, don't have the status of asylum seekers, some of them may in fact seek asylum because they say they can't get back. So the whole enterprise of people moving around the world is a monumental political issue on a global scale, and is a monumental issue for a country like the United States, which used to be welcoming, and is a monumental economic issue for countries, all of whose populations are aging, which will need people from other societies. And that raises the question of when you have relatively homogeneous populations, and then you have to integrate other people. Can you integrate them temporarily? Can you allow them to integrate permanently? That is an issue for this century, because people will be on the move, not just because of political instability and religious prosecution and political prosecution, but because climate change makes it impossible for people to continue to live where they are. So migration, immigration, asylum, refugees are probably one of the biggest problematic for this century. In many cases, secondary issues flowing from increasing problems of climate change, increasing issues of authoritarian government, increasing issues of ethnic discrimination when things get difficult in a society. So while, some of us may have an interest or fascination with the topic, it is a major political issue. And shockingly, the US is a nation of immigrants, in contrast, let's say, to Canada and Australia, which is much more organized and has better procedures, is completely disorganized right now with a backlog of years to process people properly. It has a mess at the border, and it's a big political football, which I anticipate will not get better because there's so much anti-immigration discrimination afoot amongst some of the political actors in our society. And this is parallel to a US economy which badly needs not only people at the bottom of the rung, which I've discussed before, but also, for example, we have a shortage of doctors and teachers and so forth. And even those kinds of visas are hard to come by because of the backlog and the inefficiency of our system. We are in a big mess with regard, we meaning the United States, with regard to this whole issue, and it's worth thinking about it and trying to be as well informed as possible. Thank you very much. I will see you in 2 weeks.